Australia closes one of its most controversial detention centres for asylum seekers. But is Manus Island just a symptom of a greater problem? Also on today's program, Bangladesh approaches boiling point after a string of attacks. Is the government doing enough to protect its people? And picture this, a warm welcome home for Singapore's golden boy after beating his childhood hero at the Summer Olympic Games. Hello and welcome to the Newsmakers with me, Andrea Sanke. It's been described as a prison, the crime committed by its inmates seeking a better life. The controversial Manus Island detention centre, located in Papua New Guinea and funded by Australia, is finally closing. It served as a symbol of Australia's strict policy against asylum seekers, a holding place for those who try to reach Australia by boat but never make it. The processing and treatment of its detainees has been shrouded in secrecy for years, but more reports of human rights abuses recently came to light. Other offshore detention centres like it still exist, as does Australia's zero-tolerance policy towards immigration by sea. Now, supporters of that policy say it's Australia's right to deny anyone who reaches its shores, and that it does not have enough resources to resettle everyone who wants to come there. Today's newsmaker is the Manus Island Detention Centre, as we ask if its closing is the beginning of the end for Australia's offshore detention policy.
If I go Iraq, kill me. Saddam Hussein kill me.
They are killing our people, especially Taliban forces.
In our country, there is no embassy of Australia. So what we were doing? Legally, it was impossible. So we were compelled to come illegally to Australia.
Refugees have been sent to Australia's offshore detention centres since 2001. 15 years later, Australia's Pacific Solution policy is under fire. It was designed to stop refugees, many travelling through Indonesia, from winding up on Australian shores. Intercepted boats were to be transferred to detention facilities in Papua New Guinea, Nauru, and Christmas Island. But now the facilities are rife with reports of abuse, sexual assault, and miserable living conditions. More than 100 former and current staff members at Australia's offshore detention camps have called for all refugees to be moved immediately. Australia's government has announced it will close the Manus Island camp located in Papua New Guinea, but with the caveat that those being held there will never reach Australia.
The government's position is very clear. That is that we are not going to accept people that have sought to come to our country illegally by boat. They will not settle permanently in our country.
Immigration in Australia is one of its most hotly contested issues. One that Tony Abbott capitalised on during his rise to power in 2013.
We would bring immigration down to 170,000 a year.
On his first day as Prime Minister, he implemented Operation Sovereign Borders, a naval crackdown on illegal immigration aimed at deterring asylum seekers from trying to make the dangerous boat journeys to Australia's shores. And while effective, the policy has not resolved the growing controversy over what happens to refugees afterwards. Critics say Australia's offshore detention facilities are in effect prisons. Transparency is an issue. Journalists are no longer allowed access to them. A recent expose about the Nauru facility in the Guardian newspaper detailed thousands of reports of rape, abuse, squalid living conditions, and attempts by detainees to harm themselves.
We are extremely concerned about the serious allegations of violence, sexual assault, degrading treatment, and self-harm contained in more than 1,000 incident reports from the offshore detention facilities on Nauru, many of which reportedly involve children.
Nauru's government has said that many of the reports of abuse are false. In April, Papua New Guinea Supreme Court ruled the Manus Detention Centre unconstitutional, laying the foundation for its recent closure. And while the Australian government has said it will relocate the 800 people held there, when and where they will go is unclear, as is the fate of detainees held at Australia's other offshore detention centres. Their long journey frozen in time. Randolph Nogle, The Newsmakers.
Well, David Manne joins me now from Melbourne. He is the Executive Director of the Refugee and Immigration Legal Centre in Australia. David Manne, thank you so much for joining us. First, if you can, just tell me about your clients. Who are they? Have they also suffered abuse? And what are they asking of Australia now?
Yes, we act for a number of women who have been brought back from Nauru, an island that they were sent to by Australia when they actually originally sought asylum in Australia. They were sent to Nauru. Now, these women were the victims of horrendous sexual assault and were brought back to Australia, and we're representing those women and as part of representation, bringing a case for each of them that they not be returned to Nauru where they fear further harm. I mean, these are women, by the way, who have been found to be refugees, who sought protection in Australia as refugees, were sent to Nauru and then suffered further severe harm before being brought back to Australia.
And whom are you trying to hold accountable for their abuse?
Well, there is no doubt whatsoever that the ultimate responsibility for the welfare and the fate of these women lies with Australia. I mean, Australia may well seek to transfer, as it has, asylum seekers, including women, children, families and single men, but it cannot transfer its responsibility for those people, even if they are sent to islands like Nauru or Manus Island in Papua New Guinea. Australia holds both the moral and the legal responsibility for their fate, and to ensure that they are safe from any further harm. Remembering these are people who have fled from very traumatic experiences in the past and are seeking safety.
Let me ask you if you think closing the Manus Detention Centre was at least a step in the right direction, or will the same problem simply be transferred on to another facility now?
Look, there's no doubt that closing the Manus Island Detention Centre and effectively this terrible practice of human warehousing in indefinite incarceration is a step forward. It's a welcome step, but it's only really a small step forward because really what it hasn't done is resolved the fundamental question at stake here, and that is what will be the fate of the almost 900 men, most of whom have been found to be refugees, in the future. And let's remember, those people who've been found to be refugees, because of that, cannot return to their home countries because it's been found to be too dangerous. We know too that Papua New Guinea is not a place that is suitable for resettlement of refugees. It's not safe, and people can't lead any form of proper life. It's not a sustainable future for people. So that's the question that now needs to be resolved. What will happen to these men having, with the decision to close the place that they're incarcerated in?
It is true. Nobody seems to be answering the question as to what is the end game for these detainees. But Australia has argued that when people apply for residency in Australia, they need to show proof of job worthiness. They need to show clean criminal records from various countries that they've lived in previously, and that these refugees arriving show absolutely nothing. They may be dangerous people. They may be criminals. Could there be a better system then for these people arriving without papers, without history, in effect, that would allow Australia to observe their basic human rights while protecting Australians themselves and not allowing these potentially dangerous people into Australian society?
Well, I don't think that there is any serious suggestion that these are dangerous people. I think there's a serious suggestion that they've fled from danger. Really, the reason why these refugees have been exiled to indefinite incarceration on Nauru and on Manus Island in PNG and been subjected to what independent, reputable agencies such as the UN Refugee Agency and Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch have consistently reported as cruel and degrading and inhuman conditions. The reason why people have been sent there is because Australia has embarked once again on a policy of essentially stopping people from seeking asylum by boat in Australia. And it's a policy of deterrence, of stopping people accessing protection in Australia if they arrive informally, and then sending them to places that are so inhumane that it sends a message to others not to come. I mean, that's at the heart of the policy. And what needs to happen, first and foremost, is that those who've been subjected to such profound inhumanity on Nauru and on Papua New Guinea in Manus Island need to be evacuated from there to safety so that they can also not only be safe in the country that they're taken to, but have a sustainable future where they can lead proper lives. But what we also need to see is Australia go through a major change whereby those that do seek protection in Australia are not subjected to further harm, having fled from harm in the past.
Let me ask you how much you think the Australian public really understands what's going on here. Do they know, and do they want to know?
I think that is a very complex question. I think that the first point is that successive Australian governments have subjected the treatment of people exiled to these islands. The policy has been under a shroud of secrecy. It's been extremely difficult for media to get in to these places, to these countries, to see what's happening. It's been extremely difficult for independent human rights investigators and watchdogs to get in to see what's actually happening. So it's been very difficult. Bit by bit, graphic evidence has emerged of systemic abuse against, children, women, families, and men. But I think that's part of the problem, is that it's been very difficult to see what the consequences are of such harsh policies. What is the price that people pay, and that we as a country pay when governments embark upon these types of policies? Because I think the other part of this is that I would accept that in Australia there has been strong support for very tough border protection policies and stopping boats arriving in Australia informally. But what I don't accept is that public support has come with a mandate to mistreat people in this way that we've seen. And so I think that what we need is to move away from this, what's been described as a binary choice between either stopping boats and harsh border protection policies, blocking anyone from getting to Australia to seek protection on the one hand, or on the other hand, those that are said to want open border policies. What we actually need to do is to strike the right balance, and that means working with our neighbours in the region, in Southeast Asia and the Pacific, but particularly in Southeast Asia, Indonesia, Thailand, Malaysia and other countries, working together in a cooperative framework to share the responsibility for protection of those people in the region who have been forced to flee from places like Afghanistan and Syria and who desperately need to be protected.
Okay. David Manne, we're going to have to leave it there. I'd like to thank you so much for joining us from Melbourne. Still to come on the Newsmakers, tensions are high in Bangladesh after a string of attacks this year. Are security forces focusing their efforts in the right places? And in Picture This, a hero's welcome. Singapore's first gold medalist returns home after beating his own Olympic idol. For the last 3 years, Bangladesh has suffered a string of violent attacks on activists, academics, and religious minorities. The most recent and deadliest so far was an attack on a cafe in the capital, Dhaka, killing 20 people, many of them foreigners. The Bangladeshi government has now launched a domestic crackdown to root out extremists, but political opponents say they are being targeted in mass arrests.
It was an attack that stunned Bangladesh. Last month, 20 people were killed in a cafe in Dhaka. Daesh later claimed responsibility, but the government blamed Bangladeshi militants from the group Jamaatul Mujahideen.
They were homegrown and took their directions from a terrorist group. I don't believe they had any foreign links.
It's the latest in a pattern of violence that's become all too familiar. Since 2013, 80 people, including activists, religious leaders, and academics, have been killed in attacks. Last year, 4 prominent secular bloggers were hacked to death. And in April, 2 gay rights activists were murdered, allegedly on the orders of Al-Qaeda. The violence has prompted a nationwide government crackdown on various splinter groups in the country. The rise in violence has led to international pressure on Bangladesh to recognize Daesh's links in the country, but the government says domestic extremist groups are responsible. Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina is blaming the pro-Pakistani Jamaat-e-Islami movement and launched a crackdown that's led to more than 11,000 people arrested. But the group says it's being wrongly persecuted. The political clashes stem from a deeper divide going back to when the country won independence from Pakistan in 1971, and pro-Pakistani movements are fighting for recognition from the secular government of Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina. Tension recently came to a head when a former leader of Jamaat, Motir Rehman Nizami, was executed for crimes during the civil war. But with old tensions coming to the fore, the people of Bangladesh are worried about security and the dangerous consequences of failing to go after the extremists, whoever they might be. Sandra Gatman, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from London is Dibyesh Anand. He is a professor of international relations at the University of Westminster. Thank you so much for joining us. First, I'd like to get your assessment of how well you think the government is doing of cracking down on extremism and keeping the country safe.
See, this is a challenge that the government in Bangladesh faces. That government is accused of being secular by the opposition, but of not being effective by the secularists there. That's the problem they're facing. So there's a key problem of political struggle between the two ruling parties. One is the ruling one, Awami League, and the BNP. They have that own struggle. Bangladesh also faces the problem of Jamaat-e-Islami that has a track record of committing genocide and also supporting genocide in Bangladesh. They have that, but they also have this problem where secularist, atheist, LGBT activists, they're being killed, and government has been ineffective so far in tackling them. So they try to arrest people who they call extremists, but so far they haven't assured secularists and others that they're safe in Bangladesh.
So the government says it wants to protect its people, but critics say it's more interested in protecting its own political interests. So how is that complicating a fight against these extremist elements?
Yeah, this is the biggest problem in Bangladesh because there's a major political crisis amongst the parliamentary democratic parties, and that crisis is unresolved. And this current government, the Awami League government, has shown no interest or no willingness to tackle that political crisis, which is in the parliament. On top of that, you have got social tensions and you have got religious extremists in particular who are using that political crisis for their own benefit. So they keep attacking the soft target that includes minorities and secularists and atheists. And government on that sense, while claiming to represent and claiming to protect people, so far has not done much. Another problem that Bangladesh faces, which many of us don't realize, is that the problem is not only local, it's not only regional in terms of confined to Bangladesh, but quite a few people who are accused of being extremists are essentially Bangladeshi migrants living in Canada and UK. That complicates the struggle.
And many also blame the United States and India for funding the government of Sheikh Hasina that's currently in power to the detriment of the security of Bangladesh. Would you agree with that?
Not really, because the problem, of course, Bangladesh, like in many other developing countries, face is that where internal politics gets associated with external politics. So in this case, Awami League is seen as someone that's closer to India. But there's no concrete evidence that shows that the Indian government or US government, or for that matter, foreign governments, are funding the government against the people. So the problem, therefore, is largely domestic, and international dimension part and parcel, but not crucial to it. In this case, we also have to keep in mind that those who are accused of extremism, and for instance, those accused of killing secularists and atheists, are also those who are seen as being funded by outsiders. Those outsiders may not be governments per se, though of course Bangladeshi government from time to time would hint at other foreign governments, but it's largely organizations throughout the world that are funding religious extremism in any case.
When the government, though, decides to execute a Jamaat-e-Islami leader, do you think that actually helps the country to heal from the wounds of a war for independence that's from decades ago? Or has it served to reopen those wounds and cause more potentially extremist behavior?
So in my reading, or it's a controversial reading, I don't think death sentence helps anywhere. There's no evidence in justice where it shows that due to death sentence, extremism or violence goes down. So I do think that Bangladesh government, like any government that supports capital punishment, has been wrong in using that against opposition figure. For instance, in these cases, where Jamaat-e-Islami leaders were accused of genocide or supporting genocide, if they're put into prison for long term, you'd find that they become more ineffective. That would be better than killing them. Because by executing them, essentially they're provoking extremists even more. And that has been a problem in Bangladesh.
And at the same time, other critics of the government say the government is in denial of Al-Qaeda and Daesh involvement in Bangladesh itself. What do you make of those criticisms, and do you think the government is indeed in denial?
It is. It's a very peculiar government that's seen as secular. That's why I said it's a government seen as secularist or overly secularist by its opposition, and it's seen as not secular enough by the secularists. And that is the problem that the government faces. In reality, the government has shown that the only interest that it has been good at protecting is the interest of the government itself and the ruling party. That has been a crisis. But there's a bigger fundamental problem that Bangladesh faces, which goes back to its liberation war. And that is a tension between broadly religious ideology, so the idea that Islam can be somehow unifying factor for nationalism, and idea of nationalism, which essentially says that religion can never be something that can bring country together. Bangladesh, in that context, is Muslim majority, but has significant number of minority and significant number of secularists. And so far, it has not shown itself very good at balancing the interest of the religious majority with those who believe that the country should be largely secular and where a minority and majority should be living equally together. And extremists are largely, and Jamaat-e-Islami ideology is very clear. Jamaat-e-Islami ideology is one that believes in religious nationalism, not in secular nationalism. And there are multiple crises there in Bangladesh that needs to be resolved.
Personally, do you think Bangladesh should be a secular country and that secularism should be constitutionally enshrined?
For me, there can be no democracy that's a religious democracy. And let me give you an example why. If there's a Hindu democracy or a Jewish democracy or a Muslim democracy or whatever democracy, that essentially implies that the head of the state has to belong to the majority community. How can that be democratic when democracy is essentially about equality between citizens? Therefore, for me, there can never be a religious democracy, because religious democracy would always support majoritarianism. So on that ground, I would argue that every democracy should be secular democracy, which should provide equality to all. Remember, secular democracy is not the French kind, which is essentially largely Islamophobic and against religion. So in essence, secular democracy that provides equality to all people, majority and minority. In that context, therefore, I would argue that Bangladesh should become a secular democracy in ethos.
So when you have an organization like Jamaat-e-Islami that people say continues to effectively function as a political party, even though that has officially been banned, it still continues to function as an Islamist political party via the Bangladesh Nationalist Party, which is in the opposition in Bangladesh. How do you keep that secularism safe?
Now, this is a challenge that many countries in the world face, and Bangladesh is not an exception here. What we have, of course, is in the past, let's say when we look at West Asia, secularist dictators would use the bogey of Islamism to counter democracy, and we have seen that in various parts of the world. Now, in Bangladesh, now, of course, now also for that matter, India, neighboring India or Pakistan, we find religious nationalism, and in case of India, you have got RSS and Hindu nationalism, and they are in power right now, who believe that India, in this case, or Bangladesh, in case of Jamaat-e-Islami, should be largely a Muslim nation or Hindu nation, other things. The problem that kind of ideology poses is that while they claim to speak for the majority, they essentially neglect minority. And let's keep in mind that democracy is not only about majority rule, it's also about minority rights and the right to dissent without fear. And therefore, when we look at the conduct of Jamaat-e-Islami and the parties like Jamaat-e-Islami, RSS, BJP and others in the region, we find that They are good at talking of majority rights and majority rule, but they're very bad when it comes to protecting minority rights and, of course, right to dissent without fear.
Okay, Dibyesh Anand, we're going to have to leave it there. I'd like to thank you so much for joining us from London. In today's Picture This, the streets of Singapore are a sea of red and white as people give a hero's welcome to their first ever Olympic gold medal winner. Let's take a look. Today's newsmaker was the Manus Island Detention Center, as we asked if its closing is the beginning of the end for Australia's offshore detention policy. The processing and treatment of its detainees have been shrouded in secrecy for years, but more reports of abuses recently came to light. But Australia's other offshore detention centers remain open, and its zero-tolerance policy toward refugees arriving by sea is still intact. You've been watching this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Andrea Sanke. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.